Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, author Mike Rothschild on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and pop culture.
The Rothschilds had really no footprint in the United States, but the conspiracy theories about them are just sort of everywhere, and they power this new spasm of anti-Semitism that happens in the United States. We want those stories to be true. We want there to be powerful forces at work, and for things not to be just random or bad luck or just somebody fell through the cracks and was able to fire a shot at the right time. So many events in history just hinge on some guy being in the right place at the right time and having the right implement to do whatever he wants to do. It absolutely sounds like a movie. You can see it in your head. The problem is that it's all fake. None of this happened.
Mike Rothschild, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah.
I do love me some conspiracy theories. I think more importantly, I do love me debunking some conspiracy theories. And you are one of the masters in terms of looking at a variety of different conspiracy theories and the culture that surrounds them, the history that has led up to them. And I'm really curious, how did you end up there? What started you down the path of focusing so much of your time on these often insidious and usually a bit unhinged ways of looking at the world that have such real effects?
Apparently, I have some sort of love of self-abuse that I did not know about as a child. Really, what started me off was enjoying the idea of conspiracy theories and the paranormal and things like that much more as stories than as anything to be debunked and pulled apart. When I was in college, I was a big fan of Art Bell, Coast to Coast AM. So, the overnight radio with, UFOs and Bigfoot and crop circles and the face on Mars. And this was in the late 90s. So Art Bell had kind of moved away from some of the more right-wing extremism that he'd been involved in. And it was this world of people and things that I didn't know anything about. Nobody that I knew talked about any of this stuff. And it felt like a whole new window on how people processed information. And, I bounced around in some different careers. Then I started to get into journalism. And this was in kind of 2012, 2013, right as conspiracy theories were becoming much more prevalent. They were becoming much more mainstream and much more acceptable. Then, of course, a couple of years later, Trump happens and becomes our first conspiracy theorist president. And now suddenly this stuff is everywhere. And it's incredibly mainstream, and it's not fringe. It's not weird. It's just sort of the world we live in. And I found that there is a real need for explaining what these things are, where they come from, why they matter, and what we can do about them.
There's a real spectrum here. The way you started out talking about some of the Art Bell stuff, some of those sound more like just mysteries than necessarily fully blown conspiracy theories, right? I'm thinking of crop circles, which on the, I don't know what we want to call the axis for the spectrum here, but crop circles are not as nefarious as some of the things we'll be talking about and some of the things you've written about, like QAnon and others. But I remember as a kid, I had this book. It's called something like Mysteries of the Ancient World or something of that sort, right? And it had everything from the Tunguska event to how were the pyramids built to Atlantis to the Nazca lines. And those were interesting to me, as some elements of them being unknown, less so now, but at the time, a lot of them had important unknowns. But those are kind of different than some of these grand conspiracy theories, unless they get built into it through something like alien control or manipulation being connected to those, right?
Right. And there's always been an aspect of conspiracism that's been about control and power and, the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the New World Order. If you go into something like 1971, you have a book like None Dare Call It Conspiracy by the Gary Allen, the John Birch Society speechwriter, which was this huge hit leading up to the 1972 election. And there was always that element there. But for most of our history, these kinds of mysteries, these kinds of sort of unsolved riddles have been something that people have been fascinated by, and that there wasn't really any harm in them, and they were interesting to talk about. Things like Bigfoot, the Tunguska event. Yeah. You had the popularity of books like Chariots of the Gods or Worlds in Collision. Mm-hmm. These things were sort of fun, and they were harmless, and maybe there was some professional debate about them, but nobody was shooting anybody over do crop circles exist? Like that wasn't a thing. It was actually more fun, and it was more, I think it was more welcoming of sort of everybody's different flavor of weird, and it wasn't quite so intense, and it definitely wasn't so political.
Do you get the sense that some of those in the 70s and 80s in particular, were they a gateway drug for some people, that once you start not just being interested in the mystery of the crop circles or learning about the technology and the abuse of human beings that could have led to the pyramid's construction, but you actually start trying to connect them to aliens and all that, does that get you closer to some of these more nefarious conspiracy theories?
I think it can, in the sense that the biggest predictor for whether somebody is going to believe a certain conspiracy theory is, do they already believe in conspiracy theories? One of the things we talk about with QAnon is, well, why do people believe QAnon is real? Well, they probably believe it because they believe other stuff before QAnon that feeds into it. But at the same time, you always had some separation. You always had a group of people who believed Jews were running the world, who believed that, Jews were using blacks as muscle against them. I mean, there were always those sort of fringe conspiracy cultures, very wrapped up in anti-Semitism, very wrapped up in scapegoating. Those worlds really didn't have anything to do with the cryptozoology, life after death, those kinds of kind of ancient mysteries. Now, unfortunately, it's all wrapped up together. And I think one of the things we really saw in QAnon and in the early days of lockdown was all of these separate conspiracy silos. So the anti-vaxxers, the everybody we don't like is a pedophile, all those different groups of people, they all merged together. And now everything is kind of the same thing, which is really unfortunate.
It's been interesting reading your work on this area, because I grew up, like I mentioned, fascinated by so many of these mysteries of the world and encountering some of what later became connected to grand conspiracy theories, especially a lot of the ancient aliens type stuff. But I rarely came across the anti-Semitic tropes and the controversies over things like the Rothschild family and things like that. I don't know why, just my little slice of culture, it wasn't something that I remember being exposed to. And yet, reading your work, I see how anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and thinking end up becoming involved in almost everything, and almost every conspiracy ends up going in that direction in one flavor or another. And it's just uncanny that some people can't avoid exposure to it, but it does actually inform a lot of the other things that are going on around it. Why did you decide to jump into and we should note for the record that the Rothschild family that we'll be talking about, most frequently associated with banking and other industry that we'll talk about, that you are not a representative of said family, and to the best of your knowledge, you are not a descendant of any of the famous Rothschilds. Is that correct?
I am not a descendant of any of the famous Rothschilds. If I were, I would not be doing podcasts. I would not be...
Your books would be better funded.
My books would definitely be better funded. And, I wouldn't be talking about any of this, because one of the things I learned early on is that the real Rothschilds don't talk about any of this stuff. The few times that they have, it's kind of turned into a train wreck. You sort of understand why they don't want to. They've really taken the position that they can't prove a negative. They can't prove they don't have $500 trillion. They don't control all the central banks. Most people don't think that anyway. And the people who do believe it are not going to accept the debunking of a Rothschild that the Rothschilds don't run everything.
It's such a double-edged sword in so many ways, right? In terms of countering misinformation or disinformation, that if you don't speak out, it appears to be some kind of tacit acknowledgement or something to hide, or no defense being possible. But if you go out and try to prove a negative, it doesn't actually change a lot of minds. So it's more, do you feel the need to put on the record, this is ridiculous, and I'm just going to call it out for the BS that it is, knowing that doing so might actually turn up the temperature instead of turning it down. It's a tough one.
It's a very tough one. And this line of how do we talk about these things without platforming them, without giving the people who are spreading them the attention that they want, but at the same time, we know now that ignoring these things and saying don't give it attention, don't feed the trolls, we know that doesn't work either. You know, I was trying to pitch stories about things like QAnon, and I would hear from editors like, we just want to ignore that and it's going to go away. Well, it didn't. And instead, it grew and it suddenly became public and nobody really knew what it was or why it mattered. So I think there is that line of paying attention to it, of talking about what it really is, how it works, and why people are so susceptible to it. That's really, for me, kind of the next stage of this work, rather than just debunking things, because by the time you do the research and you talk to people and you dive into the archives and you figure out where all this stuff has come from, the conspiracy world's already moved on.
Well, I don't want to go back, to the beginning of all anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, because as much as people would enjoy a 3-week audio podcast.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much time do you have?
We can't record that long in one setting. So I do really want to start with just the setting for the Rothschilds conspiracy and how that began in, I think, the 1700s in Germany, and not too long after the position of the family. Then, of course, the conspiracy thinking started. But give us that background. Give us the background of how the family got started and how quickly they became international moneylenders of the sort that became such a target for conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah, and it actually happened fairly quickly for the times. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was the patriarch of the family, and he was a small-time coin dealer, and he sold rare metals. He was the banker to one of the crown princes of the Holy Roman Empire. So this was in the late 1700s. And he eventually amassed quite a fortune. And by the early 1800s, he and his couple of his sons really had started to make a footprint on continental banking. There was a Rothschild representative in London. There was a Rothschild representative in Paris. Of course, the family was headquartered in Frankfurt. And they were starting to carve out a name for themselves. And then they made an enormous amount of money on the Napoleonic Wars. So there was a blockade of the continent. And Mayer, and at this point, really more his sons, Mayer died in 1815. His sons essentially came up with a system to smuggle gold and paper money from England to the continental forces that were fighting against Napoleon, so particularly Wellington's forces. So, of course, all of this culminates in the Battle of Waterloo. The family made loans. They had all kinds of different financial schemes going, and they were able to make this enormous profit off of the war.
Now, I'm familiar with that. That is, I've heard the story and the foundation of the family, and even that the fact that, the Napoleonic Wars, they weren't the only ones, but they were a prominent example of people, making money due to the disruption of normal trade, the opportunities that come up. I've heard that, but something that I had not heard before that apparently is huge was the claim that the family, well, I'll let you tell the story, but the Battle of Waterloo itself in 1815.
Yes.
And the seemingly incredible, almost insane story that somehow the family, if not responsible for the outcome of the battle, certainly manipulated the information about the battle in a way to take their wealth to new heights. Talk through that and explain to me, like I'm a fifth grader hearing this for the first time, which I kind of was recently, how that story goes and why it is that it falls apart upon pretty easy examination.
Sure. So Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, the Napoleonic Wars, essentially. And 30 years later, a story starts to emerge in the burgeoning socialist anti-wealth movement in France. And of course, at this point, James de Rothschild is one of the sons of Mayer, is one of the richest men in France, and he has control over French industry, particularly the railroads. So there's a lot of animosity building towards familial wealth in general, and in particular the Rothschilds. It wasn't so much Judaism. It was much more the concentration of wealth in a small group of people. And in 1846, a pamphlet appears in Paris written under the name Satan that accuses Nathan Rothschild, who was the London member of the family, another son of Mayor, of having known the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo in advance and having been on the battlefield. He was so close he could smell the cannon smoke and see the anguish on the faces of the dead, and seeing Napoleon's forces being defeated. He gets on his fine steed and rides across Belgium, gets to a port in a once in a century channel storm, and bribes a terrified sailor to take him across the channel. He gets to the London Stock Exchange a day later. He's so exhausted, he slumps against his favorite pillar, and all of the other bankers are looking at him and going, Rothschild knows the outcome of the battle. He looks defeated. We've lost. We have to sell everything. So, of course, the conniving Nathan has his agents secretly buying up all of the depressed stocks. Well, then the real news of Waterloo, the fact that the British and the Prussians have won the battle, that comes in, those stocks suddenly skyrocket in value, and suddenly Nathan Rothschild is the richest man in the British Empire, and he has enough money that he has total control over British finance. So that story emerges 30 years after the battle.
That is a beautiful story.
It is. It's very cinematic.
It sounds like a Hollywood script.
It does. It absolutely sounds like a movie. You can see it in your head. The problem is that it's all fake. None of this happened. We know that none of it happened. They knew almost immediately that none of it happened. But this story was so compelling to people who were caught up in this kind of socialist anti-wealth fervor that it really kicks off a pamphlet war in Paris in 1846 and 1847. Then in 1848, you have this series of revolutions around the continent that were very much driven by this wealth inequality, this rising tide of socialism. So all of this stuff gets kind of bound up, and you have the kind of instant urban legend about why this family is so rich. Why are they so powerful? Well, here's why. It doesn't matter that it's not true. It just sounds like it could be true because nobody knows the difference.
And this goes back to a lot of things having to do with conspiracy theories, which is if there's a big effect, I think our human brains are wired to think, well, there must be a big cause, right? 9/11 couldn't have been hijackers with knives. It must have been Dick Cheney and the U.S. government wiring the buildings to explode, or Kennedy could not have been shot by a loser with a rifle. It must have been this multifaceted international plot. Similarly here, there's a pretty big effect, which is, by the early to mid 1800s, the family is massively wealthy and does have influence across Europe in interesting ways. Therefore, there must have been something that caused that. It couldn't just be decades of shrewd investments and connections and building wealth over time. No, it must be something like an evil machination involving the Battle of Waterloo.
Right. It has to be something bigger than they were just good investors, and they had systems. They had a communication system that was well ahead of everybody else. They had some luck. It was right place, right time. And this is how they built their empire. And I think so many conspiracy theories stem from that need, like you were saying, to explain something with a story that is bigger, grander, involves more people, because we want those stories to be true. We want there to be powerful forces at work, and for things not to be just random or bad luck, or just somebody fell through the cracks and was able to fire a shot at the right time. So many events in history just hinge on some guy being in the right place at the right time and having the right implement to do whatever he wants to do. It doesn't need to be a bigger story than that, but that's not satisfying for us. That's not enough for us.
Yeah. We'll get to the United States explicitly later, but at this point in the early 1800s, the family's story really is a European story. And because Americans tend to be really bad at history, especially history outside of the United States, talk a little bit about 1848 and what was happening in Europe in 1848, why it was so momentous, and why the growth of conspiracies around and after that time.
So in 1848, you have basically a year of revolution. It's literally called the Revolutions of 1848. And it was this growing unease with wealth, with the concentration of wealth in certain families and certain royal dynasties. It's very kind of anti-royalty, anti-banks. And every country kind of has its own variation on it, particularly for the Rothschilds with this French pamphlet. One of the other things that's in this pamphlet, it's not just the Waterloo story. There's actually two stories in it. The other story is there's this train crash that takes place outside of Paris in 1846, and it was on James de Rothschild's line, and I think at the time it was one of the worst, or maybe it was the worst train crash in French history. And this was a time when rail travel was still fairly new, and these stories about what would happen to people during train crashes made for a very compelling newsprint. And in particular, James de Rothschild was seen as somebody who was destroying French livelihood, destroying the natural beauty of France to build these cheap and shoddy railroads. And he doesn't care whether Christian Frenchmen die. He just wants the trains to keep running. So it's very bound up in kind of personal grievance, and also this grievance of wealth being concentrated at the very top. And these revolutions really flame out in about a year. They don't really accomplish all that much, but it starts to set people against wealthy dynasties. And of course, the wealthiest dynasty is one that is also very publicly Jewish. So you have an enormous amount of anti-Semitism that's in these communities. And then after that, you would see these spasms of anti-wealth, anti-Semitism really crop up, certainly in Europe, particularly in France, also in the United States. And it would happen kind of once every 20 or so or 30 years, there would be this rush of attacks on wealthy Jews, given, whatever cultural context was going on at the time.
It's interesting to look at these stories that come up about when it is the conspiracism peaks and goes down, right? It is every few decades, it seems to be. And sometimes there's the core element of truth, right? Which is if the story is that the family manipulated the information around the Battle of Waterloo, you're like, no, that didn't happen. But the core truth is they made a lot of money during the Napoleonic Wars. So
right.
There's a piece of it that makes it, in Stephen Colbert speak, gives it truthiness.
Yeah.
Similarly, you have, the issue, I think it was the Suez Canal. There are rumors that the family basically built the Suez Canal and manipulated it to make money off of it. But, they did have a role in England's share in the Suez Canal, right? Even though they didn't help build it.
Right. They did not finance the construction of the canal. What they were able to do is essentially finance England buying, I believe it was Egypt's share of the canal. Benjamin Disraeli went to Rothschild. Rothschild wrote him a check, and then England paid them back. I mean, it really was a time when private banking was essentially a bunch of wealthy families just gave out money and made loans and made a lot of money in interest. That's not the way it works anymore. And of course, the Rothschilds really struggled to adapt to the changes in banking. It's one of the many reasons why the family started to recede in wealth and power in the second half of the 19th century and then well into the 20th century. But of course, the conspiracy theorists don't want to hear that. They just say, well, they found new ways to hide their money, or, oh, you think they let themselves be put on the Forbes rich list? Ha ha ha. How naive are you? And in reality, the Rothschilds were enormously wealthy. They were enormously powerful. They never controlled all of central banking. They never funded both sides of every war. They would sometimes have countries go to war where they had interests in both countries, but that's not the same thing. That's a lot more complicated, and it's not as compelling a conspiracy theory.
But it requires people to hold two ideas in their head that are difficult to reconcile, which is, on the one hand, a fabulously wealthy extended family by the standards of the time and even now, which is being called upon by some of the rulers of some of the largest countries in Europe to provide money. And people have this image in their mind of royal families, kings and queens, having all the wealth themselves. So the fact that they would go to this family and say, we need money, that makes sense historically, but not according to the fairy tale view of kings, queens, countries. So on the one hand, you've got, it's a family that was involved with a lot of major ruling families in Europe and financed a lot of interesting things. And on the other side, you have the fact that they were just one of many, a big one of many.
Sure.
But they were one of many people involved in these power relationships across many borders, more influential in some countries and territories than in others. And they weren't pulling the strings of policies left and right and manipulating events decades in the future. People have a hard time holding both beliefs at the same time, don't they?
Right. It's very difficult for people to look into the nuance that their theory requires, and that would in many cases invalidate their theory. And yes, there were many, many other wealthy families in Europe. Some of them were Jewish, some of them weren't. But you don't get the conspiracy theories about the Sassoons or Barings or any number of other families. You don't get them about the Guggenheims here. You get them some about Rockefeller, but always, with like political alliances and things like that. It falls on Rothschild because the Rothschilds were very visibly Jewish, and also because at some point these things just take on a life of their own. And it becomes much easier for conspiracy theorists to blame Rothschild because they've been doing it for decades or generations. And what you find with a lot of conspiracy theorists is that they're very lazy, and they don't want to do the work of creating a new villain. They've already got the villain. It's just the permutations of what is the villain doing this time and how are we going to expose it? They just don't want to do a lot of work. And so Rothschild becomes a very easy stand-in for Jewish European wealth.
Yeah. I think I knew that during the 1800s, at a time when, late 1800s in particular, as the United States narrative, people are starting to get concerned about the robber barons and, the whole social and labor awareness coming up, that the Rothschilds were extending well beyond banking, especially acquiring mining interests on a global scale. Is that right?
Yeah, they were international. They had I think the biggest ruby mine in Burma. They owned the largest nickel mine in the world. They had interests in Russia, they had interests in Cuba, they had interests in Mexico. They were incredibly wealthy. They had their agents everywhere. Now the family mostly stayed in Europe, which is another one of the reasons why they are no longer the wealthy, powerful dynasty that people thought of them as 100 years ago. But they sort of had people all over the place on the west coast of America, in South America, in the sort of the Siberian wastes. I mean, you could find a Rothschild bank or a Rothschild mine or a Rothschild oil refinery kind of everywhere. And it's another one of those things where if you are blaming a wealthy dynasty for your own personal problems, which we still do that today, Rothschild is probably going to be the most visible one. They've got the palaces, they've got the art. Hey, there's a Rothschild refinery. Hey, there's a Rothschild ruby mine. They're sort of everywhere, and they are unapologetically Jewish. And you start to weave them into the fabric of kind of what's gone wrong in your own life. And that's really how conspiracism takes hold of a person.
You researched and wrote about, among many other aspects of this, the involvement of the family with Cecil Rhodes and South Africa and diamonds. Talk through that.
Yeah, and it's kind of a story that doesn't reflect well on the Rothschilds. They were very interested in diamond mining in South Africa, and they had a relationship with Cecil Rhodes, who of course moved down to what was then known as the Cape Colony, eventually became its governor. They had a very close relationship. I think it's Nat Rothschild, who was the grandson or great grandson of Mayer. The genealogy gets kind of mixed up after a while. And they weren't actively complicit in some of the brutality toward the South African people, but they didn't do anything to stop it. And they wrote letters about how much money they were making and this is all great. Now, at some point, they wanted to work with some other people in South Africa. I can't remember which family it was, but they wanted to get involved with some other group and Cecil Rhodes wouldn't have it. And of course, the British police down there were becoming more and more violent, and the relationship eventually fell apart, and the Rothschilds sold off their shares in De Beers. But there is an uncomfortable aspect of colonialism, of the oppression and exploitation of people. You know, it's always one of those things where how much of it can you blame on the Times? How much did they know? How much were they complicit? And it you know, that for my purposes, is not something I was digging too deeply into, pardon the pun, but you do have these uncomfortable connotations. And there is a reason why there was animosity towards families like the Rothschilds, because they were involved in that kind of exploitation. So by no means is this a family that had completely clean hands with the scramble for Africa. Nobody involved in it did.
The oddity of the family to me is that in the 1800s, as the United States of America was, going from an afterthought of colonies, newly independent country in the span of 100 years to becoming a global power after 1898, this is a natural for the family to move in. If they were involved in Spanish mining companies and Oceania and Burma and Siberia and South Africa, well, of course, they're going to take advantage of the business, one of the biggest business opportunities the world has known.
Right.
And yet the mystery is that the Rothschilds really didn't get a direct foothold in the United States. Why is that?
There's a couple of reasons. The first is that they just didn't want to come here. It was too far from their home base. It was just, they were just comfortable in Europe. Never underestimate what malaise can do to a person. But they also were really confounded by how America's legal and financial systems worked. The differences between federal laws, state laws, local laws, they absolutely had no handle on this. So what it means is that their interests in the country, and they did have interests in New York, in San Francisco, they weren't particularly well tended to. So one of the stories that I talk about in the book is this Rothschild agent who went by August Belmont. He changed his name from Schoenberger, I think. He was actually on his way to Cuba, and he stopped off in New York. He checked in at the Rothschilds agents in New York, and they'd closed. They'd gone under I think in the Panic of 1837. And he just decides that he's going to stay in New York and start doing business for himself and for the Rothschilds. And of course, that name Belmont would become very well known. The Belmont racetrack, the Belmont Stakes. He became a very big power player in the Democratic Party. So August Belmont kind of stayed in the country. The Rothschilds didn't really approve of what he was doing, but they also didn't really do anything to stop him. And what eventually happened is he sort of became their point person when the Civil War broke out, and it was sending them very detailed letters about what was going on, how Rothschild business interests and farming interests were faring during the war. So eventually you have this conspiracy theory that the Rothschilds and the Confederates were working together, and the Rothschilds funded the Confederacy, or if you're really conspiratorial, that they funded both sides of the war. None of that was true. And we know from the letters that Belmont sent back that he basically said, like, the Confederacy is going to lose this war. Like, they can't win. And the Rothschilds just stayed out of it. They didn't do anything. But of course, that doesn't matter to the conspiracy theorists because they want to believe. So you get these cockamamie theories in the beginning of the 20th century that the Rothschilds were going to divide America between Britain and France, and this is crazy stuff. But they really struggled in America because of all these different laws, because central banking was something that so many Americans really distrusted, and just because nobody wanted to go there.
I think it's interesting that even though they were not the kind of the background cultural presence that they were in most European countries, they still found their way into conspiracy talk in the United States. That is, it wasn't just in Europe that people were talking about the Rothschilds and the Civil War. The stories were around floating in the United States in the 19th century that, maybe Abraham Lincoln wasn't giving in to the family's demands, and that's why they hired John Wilkes Booth.
Right. Yeah. And you get this a lot, and it happens later, well after the Civil War, this idea that, Andrew Jackson was fighting against the Rothschilds and they tried to assassinate him. Well, if the Rothschilds tried to assassinate Andrew Jackson, they probably wouldn't have hired a mentally ill house painter to do it. They probably would have, hired somebody who actually could do the job. That's why all of these presidential assassination theories fall apart so easily.
Right.
But there was this kind of idea of the Rothschilds that was brought to the United States by immigrants. Certainly Jews coming over to the United States had an idea of who the Rothschilds were, and a very complimentary one. But for a lot of German, Italian, Irish immigrants, they had grown up with these ideas of the Rothschilds as this kind of wealthy, powerful elite. And so the conspiracy theories in the United States, particularly in the 20th century, once we get something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, they take on a much, much bigger role than the Rothschilds actually had in the United States. The Rothschilds had really no footprint in the United States, but the conspiracy theories about them are just sort of everywhere. And they power this new spasm of anti-Semitism that happens in the United States, really leading up to the 1920s and 30s, built around these stories around families like the Rothschilds.
Let's talk about that a bit. You mentioned there the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And if we'd be in a better world if nobody had to hear about this and nobody had to know the story. But for those who haven't heard it, explain in brief what we know about the origin of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but how influential it was for people who wanted to find nefarious aspects of the family and of Jewish conspiracies in general.
Sure. And the protocols were initially published in Russia in the early 1900s. I think it was 1903. And they were very much a product of the institutionalized anti-Semitism of Tsarist Russia. Mm-hmm. And they are a hoax. They're clearly a hoax. You know exactly where the source material comes from. Still don't know exactly who wrote them. A number of scholars have different theories. I'm certainly not enough of an expert to pick one of them. It's like that, and it doesn't matter at a certain point. They are translated into English in 1920, and they immediately start to pick up steam in this kind of isolationist, America first, extremely anti-Semitic, let's not get into another Jewish war movement of the 30s. And of course, one of their biggest evangelists is Henry Ford. Prints this long series of articles in his paper, the Dearborn Independent, that almost verbatim reprint the protocols. And he makes them enormously popular in the United States. Eventually apologizes for it, but not in a way that people really believed. So the protocols show up as this supposed document that is the minutes of a meeting of the powerful Jews that run the world. And they're talking about how they're going to flood the Christian people with pornography and with, attacks on their religion. And we're going to control the media and we're going to turn everybody against each other. And the protocols are debunked as a hoax fairly quickly after they've been published in English. But what you find is that people who extol the protocols will also say, well, yeah, they may not be real. They may be a hoax, but the ideas are real. And there's truth in them, even if they themselves are not truthful. And of course, we see this all the time now with these conspiracy theories. Well, it's not really true that blah, blah, blah is happening, but the ideas are true. And so therefore it is true. So it really turns into this thing where the document itself isn't as important as the people who are taking the document and repurposing it for their own ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Back to the family itself. One of the things that, to me, looking at this across the sweep of hundreds of years, that debunks some of the big conspiracy theories about just how powerful they are, the puppet master theory, is that you have the greatest conflict, the First World War, where everyone is involved in Europe, and the loss of life and property is staggering. And then just a brief interruption before the Second World War. And you would think that people who are manipulating events so well would have the same kind of exponential growth from that happened after the Napoleonic Wars. And instead, we find that they didn't actually succeed much during those wars, and in fact, certainly didn't expand their wealth to the extent that one might think. Apart from the Holocaust itself, which the family actually escaped some of the horrors better than so many others. But apart from that, what were the dynamics of the wars in the 20th century that kind of show the Rothschilds are not pulling all the strings and making all the right decisions?
Sure. And of course, you get these conspiracy theories that the Rothschilds funded both sides of all the wars and they just sat back and watched the killing and the misery. In World War I, it was J.P. Morgan who made the massive Anglo-French loan to really keep up the war effort against the German Empire. I think the French Rothschilds may have had something to do with making some introductions, but they didn't have the money. Morgan and some of the other American financiers did. The Rothschilds actually lost a great deal during the First World War. Three of the major heirs of the British branch of the family all died, and they were absolutely hammered by the income tax. Multiple Rothschilds fought on both sides in the war because, of course, there was the Austrian Rothschild branch. There were still Rothschilds in Germany, not as many anymore, but there were multiple members of the family who were killed or wounded in battle. They did their duty. But they weren't pulling the strings because they didn't have the resources to do it. And of course, then when you get to the interwar period, it is a Rothschild bank in Austria, the Kreditanstalt, where the European financial contagion really starts. This starts to get really complicated. They merged with another bank and they were over leveraged, and there were very arcane Austrian laws about kind of what kind of reserves a bank needed to have. The Kreditanstalt basically collapsed and started a bank run in Austria. That bank run then moved on to Germany, moved on to France. Within a very short amount of time, the entire world is in economic upheaval. Of course, the Depression had already started in the US, but now it had taken over the entire world. And this kind of economic deprivation really was the thing that helped propel the Nazis to power. And they were able to look at it and say, look, the Rothschilds did this to us. And one of the things that happened is early on, one of the Austrian Rothschild heirs was taken prisoner by the Gestapo. And he was eventually released, but the family had to pay, I think, the largest hostage ransom in history. I think it still might be hundreds of millions of dollars now, adjusted for inflation. Rothschild industries were seized. Rothschild palaces were used as, SS garrisons. Their artwork was looted by Hermann Goering. It was a calamitous time for the family. Far from this idea that you find in post-war anti-Semitic and extremist literature that, they were just, hiding out in their Paris hotels and laughing at the rest of us. They suffered as much as any other wealthy Jewish family suffered. So did the Rothschilds, and in a lot of ways, the family never recovered.
Is it right that none of the major members, that is the direct descendants, none of them actually died in the camps, right?
Right. They were able to escape. They did have the resources to get out. A couple of extended family members, I think one was killed at Auschwitz and another was killed at, I think, Ravensbrück, but I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't remember. But their losses were much more financial. The Austrian branch never recovered. It disappeared after the war. It took decades for them to get some of their properties back. Some of them were taken by the Soviets after the war, and it would take a long time for them to kind of restore these things. Some of their artworks were never found again. The British and French branches were basically on their knees after the war because everybody was. Mm-hmm. So, the idea that they profited handsomely off these wars, I mean, it's just, it is obviously not true.
Yeah. It's beyond the scope of this conversation to go fully into the Nazis and how they both incorporated and dramatically expanded anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But it is a good stepping stone to talk about the intersection of anti-Semitism with culture and pop culture, especially in the second half of the 20th century and into contemporary times. So there were books and movies that had been written about the family, but I think the most notorious one was in the 1940s or the late 30s in Germany?
So 1940.
Okay.
There's a couple of films, and there's a film called The Rothschilds' Share in Waterloo, which is basically a Nazi retelling of the Rothschild myth, but it essentially takes the Waterloo story and tells it as the truth. And it's basically based on this 1934 film called The House of Rothschild, which was a film by 20th Century Studios that was trying to address the uptick in anti-Semitism and the peril being felt by European Jews at a time when Hollywood essentially had a moratorium on telling Jewish stories. And this will be familiar to anybody who's followed the entertainment industry now, and our fear of inflaming China. Well, a lot of movie studios didn't want to lose access to the markets of Germany. They wanted their movies to show there. And they saw what happened in 1930 when All Quiet on the Western Front debuted there. There were riots. Nazi brown shirts were throwing stink bombs into theaters where it was showing. So the Hollywood industry wanted nothing to do with dramatizing Hitler, nothing to do with dramatizing the Nazis. But Darryl Zanuck, who, 20th Century Studios was his creation, he wanted to tell an affirmational Jewish story. And he told the story of the Rothschilds and their growth and eventually kind of what happened around Waterloo. It's hugely fictionalized. The Nazis took this and basically turned it into a photo negative that turns the Rothschilds into these conniving financial fraudsters. And then, of course, there's another film called The Eternal Jew, which is a faux documentary that takes footage from the 1934 film and says, this is an example of the American Rothschilds, or maybe they didn't say the American Rothschilds, but of the conniving nature of the Rothschilds, a film made by American Jews. Well, nobody who made The House of Rothschild was Jewish. They couldn't be. And in fact, it was one of the things that really was able to propel that film was it couldn't be a story that Jews tell. It had to be a story that was told by outsiders. So they take this film, they use it as evidence of the Rothschilds being these conniving fraudsters. And then this film goes into how the Jews are vermin and, destroy everything they touch and are destroying the racial purity of Germany. And only the Aryan man can take up arms against them. I mean, it's just horribly, horribly inflammatory stuff. But these films came out in 1940 because the Nazi regime was actually somewhat disappointed by the reaction to the Kristallnacht pogrom. You didn't have a mass uprising against Jews. You didn't see the German people as a whole going into the street and like killing every Jew and smashing their business. There was some of it, obviously, but it didn't, they needed to get the German people to a place where they'd be comfortable with the mass murder of Germans. And you do that through dehumanizing, through turning these people into a threat, into something that's going to destroy their livelihood. And these propaganda films really played a role in that.
Mm-hmm. It's also probably at this time or in the decades after, certainly, that it seems like the anti-Semitism surrounding the family and much wider goes from just focusing on, these bad Jews doing these bad things and making a lot of money and manipulating people, right? That's been there for a while. But connecting that with others that are perceived to be doing things like the Illuminati, right? Or Freemasonry. And suddenly you start getting the intersection of these such that by the 1980s or 90s, you have people like Pat Robertson, who was a prominent candidate for the president of the United States, who is talking quite openly and essentially raising money on a television program, talking about the interconnection of the family and Freemasons and the Illuminati. How did that develop and kind of take it from just a way of looking at a particular family or a particular stereotype and suddenly getting into true grand conspiracy territory?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because this is a time of real kind of global upheaval, and the USSR is collapsing, East Germany is gone. Our geopolitics have completely changed. And what particularly the far right needs is a new enemy. And it is much easier to take the old enemy, which is, wealthy Jewish power, and fuse them with another new enemy, the idea of the New World Order, not as a concept, but as an actual organization, and mix it all together with the occult and the Freemasons and the Bavarian Illuminati and all these other things. And of course, Pat Robertson was really good at doing that. And he had a #1 bestseller with the New World Order in 1991. And it took a couple of years, but eventually conservative scholars figured out that he had cribbed a lot of this from a 1920s book called Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, written by this British fascist named Nesta Webster. Webster had cribbed it from the Protocols. And it was sort of jarring that, like, here is a really well-known figure in American religion, politics, and popular culture who is laundering the most anti-Semitic book of all time. And of course, Pat Robertson responds, I would never knowingly take anything from the Protocols. I love the Jewish people. I love Israel. I just have some problems with some of the bankers and what do they intend for us? So you always had that fig leaf of, well, it's not all the Jews. It's just these Jews that just happen to be really well known and beloved in the Jewish community. And, you know, we're going to use things like the Protocols and the really poisonous work of people like Gary Allen and Cleon Skousen and all these kind of Cold War era, hardcore anti-Semitic, anti-communist. And we're going to mix it all together. We're going to make a lot of money off it. But I don't hate Jews. No, of course not.
Oh, I'm just laughing at the inanity of it all, but it has real consequences, right?
It absolutely does.
You have a Tree of Life shooting that ends up, you know, based on a lot of this thinking, even if it's, you know, well, I'm actually not trying to target everyone, right?
Right. It seems insane. And for a long time, it was easy to write off as, well, it's crazy people. Yeah. It's like the guy, you know, pushing the shopping cart and, you know, wearing a surgical mask and screaming about fluoride. Well, now it's just everywhere and it's incredibly easy to access and make yourself, and if you're good at it, make a career out of it. Yeah. That's where it's really, really troubling.
There's the one aspect of this along those lines that does get into the crazy, disturbing territory to me is the intersection with people like David Icke and his belief in the lizard people, right? The reptilian aliens who have taken over human bodies or possess them. It's still unclear to me. And how you take it. It's incredible.
Yeah. And as much as David Icke has written, it tends to be incredibly repetitive. So it's like he's written all of these different books, but they all kind of say the same thing. And it is really taking this idea of these powerful outside controllers. And of course, the reptilians are working with the Jews. They're working with the bankers. They're working with the royal families. They're part of those groups. So in a sense, you're taking something that's been a staple of science fiction for generations, this idea of like aliens secretly controlling us, and you're infusing it with the anti-Semitism that's already part of these communities. And you're not selling this to mainstream science fiction fans. You're selling it to the fringe. Yeah. And if you're really good at it, you can turn that into your personality the way somebody like David Icke has done.
I just had a chat with Sarah Scholes for the another episode of this podcast on the UFO culture and how this happens within the UFO culture too. If you go from trying to explain mysterious lights to aliens are controlling our bodies, and how that's not actually a huge leap for many people. But in this sense, with the anti-Semitism linking in with the beliefs in lizard people and aliens, yes, there's the science fiction aspect of just that. The vaguely humanoid but reptilian aliens. Got that part from science fiction. But it also led to this subculture believing in blood banks and a breeding program, and perhaps the Rothschilds or other leading Jewish families were involved in this extensive multi-generational breeding program. I mean, that kind of sounded to me like they were just ripping that off from Frank Herbert and Dune. But I don't know. I don't know which came first.
Well, it's hard to tell. And a lot of this stuff is really ripped off from science fiction because you're telling these things as stories. And if you're going to tell a story, you got to tell a lot of it. And it's got to be really, really detailed. And it's got to go to really weird places. Yeah. So you use the science fiction of these legendary writers and take their concepts and completely pervert them, because you know that this stuff works. You know that lots of people read Dune. Lots of people read the Conan the Barbarian novels. So let's take this, Robert E. Howard's lizard alien people, and let's really run with it. Most people, it's going to be repulsive, but for a few people, they're going to go, oh, finally, somebody explained all of it. Yeah. And then you got them.
Yeah. Another aspect of pop culture around these issues that I can't help but talk about is Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut,
Sure.
which you've done some writing about. And I think it's unfortunate in a different sense than we've been talking about, which is Kubrick, through most of his career, he was researching ideas. He was adapting books for the screen. In many of those, there were Jewish characters, some of them more appealing than others, but many of them had Jewish characters. And routinely on screen, he would essentially de-Jewify. I don't know what the right word is. The character, because he did not, as a Jew from New York, he did not want to feed into stereotypes or to portray people negatively and be associated being the only Jewish character in the movie doing something and then getting a finger pointed at them. So he routinely tried not to do that over many movies. But then, of course, in Eyes Wide Shut, he actually casts, I think the character's name was Ziegler,
the Sidney Pollack
as
character,
the doctor kind of behind this, rich elite having this, the orgy and all of this. And it kind of fed into some stereotypes, and he knew what he was doing. He was finally kind of going there. But I think it got wrapped up in a whole lot of the conspiracism that even he may not have thought it would.
Yeah. And of course, some of the conspiracism was about his death, and he died right before the film came out. I think he'd seen a final cut, or he'd produced the final cut of it, and he died shortly after. And of course, that gets wrapped up in the conspiracy theories because, well, he's showing the elite and their sick hedonism, and of course, they had to get rid of him. Well, I mean, he wasn't the healthiest person, so maybe that had something to do with it. But of course, also, like, the movie came out, like. If the Illuminati tried to stop the movie by killing Kubrick, like, oops, sorry, you failed.
That was a whiff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the all-powerful deep state that can't actually ever accomplish anything. Another one of those kind of holding two different thoughts at the same time. And of course, then you have the idea of the Rothschilds and the surrealist ball that they had in 1972. And people are like, well, he's dramatizing this Rothschild Illuminati ball, and they shot it at this Rothschild mansion. It had been a Rothschild mansion, but the Rothschilds hadn't owned it in decades. That surrealist ball, those photos they're weird. I mean, it's like rich people doing a weird rich party, but those weren't in the popular culture at the time the film came out. That's all post hoc.
Yeah, that's what occurred
to me. So there's really nothing there unless you want there to be. And then you start making the connections and you start blaming the Rothschilds for killing him and like, trying to suppress the truth. Well, again, the film came out and was successful, so they didn't do it that well. But it really is this need to take these things and imbue them with these stories that really aren't necessary at all to kind of getting the point of that Kubrick was trying to make with that film, which is about, the depravity of the rich and all of these other things. Doesn't need to have an anti-Semitic element to it. In fact, it really obscures the points he's trying to make with it.
I think one of the interesting things you've pointed out, and I know you're continuing to explore in your current work and your next book, is the intersection of some of these conspiracy theories, most dramatically including the anti-Semitic ones, intersecting with issues of our time. And of course, climate change being one of those. And I vaguely recall the story of the Washington, D.C. city council member who blamed an early snowfall in Washington on climate control and the Rothschilds. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was there was just an early snowfall in DC, and this guy, this Washington DC city councilman, is like, you see what the Rothschilds are doing with weather control? And you're like, whoa, no real need to go there. But people fall back on this stuff because it's a shorthand. And I think even sometimes people don't mean it to be anti-Semitic. It's just horribly anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. This, of course, leads us to perhaps the most dramatic case of this, which you used as the title of your most recent book, Jewish Space Lasers. And the shorthand for that has become that Marjorie Taylor Greene, soon to become a U.S. representative, had put out a Facebook post in which she blamed Jewish space lasers for starting fires in the United States. Now, it's not quite that. And I myself had to go back and look at the original Facebook post. And just to reset everybody, I'm actually going to read parts of it here. And these are all the words. All of these are actual words that are in her post. I'll skip some of the things in the middle, but here's the core of it that relates to this issue. And then I want to hear you talk through how this became known as the Jewish space lasers thing, even though she doesn't use those words in that order anywhere in the post, but kind of how this really captures so many of the things we've talked about. So this is November 17th, 2018. She writes that the fires in California are a horrific tragedy. I'm praying for all involved. I'm posting this in speculation because there are too many coincidences to ignore, and just putting it out there from some research I've done stemming from my curiosity over PG&E stocks. I find it very interesting that Roger Kimmel on the board of directors of PG&E is also vice chairman of Rothschild Inc., the international investment banking firm. I also find interesting the long history of financial contributions that PG&E has made to Jerry Brown over the years and the millions spent in lobbying. What a coincidence it must be that Governor Brown signed a bill in September 2018 protecting PG&E and allowing PG&E to pass off its cost of fire responsibility to its customers in rate hikes and through bonds. It must just be a coincidence that the fires are burning in the same projected areas that the $77 billion high-speed rail project is to be built, which also happens to be Governor Brown's pet project. Then, oddly, there are all these people who have said they saw what looked like lasers or blue beams of light causing the fires, and pictures and videos. I don't know anything about that, but I do find it really curious. PG&E's partnership with Solarin on space solar generators starting in 2009. Now, it goes on, and there's more, connective tissue supposedly between Solarin and all of this, but she leads to the comment, could that cause a fire? I don't know. I hope not. That wouldn't look so good for PG&E, Rothschild Inc., Solarin, or Jerry Brown. I don't want to say help us make sense of this because it's hard to make sense of this, but explain how this really captured so much of background. Even someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says she was unfamiliar with the Rothschild connection to anti-Semitic theories, but how it really brings together these themes and then becomes a whole meme of its own about a belief that, those Jews are so powerful, they can even shoot lasers from space to do controlled burns.
Yeah. And it's not, the conspiracy theory itself is sort of inexplicable. I read it a few times for the book, and I'm just like, this is so overly detailed and involves so many different people and companies. You don't need that to start a fire in hot, dry California. There were forest fires before that. But what you really had was this idea that here's a member of Congress who believes this stuff. And of course, she wrote that post well before she was a member of Congress. It was a couple of years earlier, and it was only dug up after she was already in office. I think it was late January 2021 when that post was finally found. But it really was sort of emblematic of where the government has gone and what kind of people are now seeking power. They're not people who want to make things better for their constituents. They think Jerry Brown and Pacific Gas and Electric worked with a Jewish bank to start a forest fire so they could build a high-speed rail. It's stuff that is so bizarre and outlandish that it sort of makes you sad that these people have gone from the fringes of society to the halls of power. And of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene can say, oh, she didn't know the Rothschilds were Jewish, but the reason why that name Rothschild is so, quote, interesting is because they're Jewish. They're a well-known Jewish banking family. She's not blaming the family for the fires, but she's saying that it's all part of this. And it's a shorthand that you speak if you're in those worlds. You know what Rothschild Inc. means. You don't need to have it explained.
So these themes and these cultural resonances have real effects because you end up having things like shootings. You end up having increases in violence. Even if people truly know nothing about the Rothschild family and didn't grow up hearing theories like this about Jewish control of everything, it still underlies a lot of these things going on.
Yeah, it does. It becomes a fabric of your worldview, that there are powerful people in control of things, and not just world events, not just finance, but you yourself. They did this to you. And I think that's one of the things that's made some of the demagoguery that we've seen from the Trump administration so compelling. It's not they're coming after me, they're coming after you. That idea is always going to be compelling in conspiracist spaces. This idea that I'm the target, I am powerful, and I need to be snuffed out by this cabal of wealthy string pullers. It takes something where you don't feel like you have any agency, and actually gives you quite a bit of agency.
And I think it's funny to come full circle with your last comment there, that there was a case, and I'm fuzzy on the details, and I'm sure you are not, but someone claiming to be, I believe it was Anna de Rothschild, someone connected to the family, who was posing and got into Mar-a-Lago and was, cozying up to Trump and hanging out with a whole bunch of very powerful and important people. But it turned out she was just playing on the myth, right?
Yeah. So this woman named Anna de Rothschild basically just started showing up in Mar-a-Lago and claiming to be part of the Rothschild family. And that name still has the power to open doors. And of course, she's driving a really nice car, and she's got the look, and she's, she acts like she belongs there. She is able to take pictures with Donald Trump, and she turned out to be a con artist. She was a grifter. No link at all to the family. She claimed to be from the Russian branch of the Rothschild family. There is no Russian branch of the Rothschild family.
She created it herself.
Nice. She just manifested it. And this, obviously it shows the sort of loosey-goosey atmosphere that's always been around Trump. And of course, we are really seeing the deleterious effects of that.
Right.
But it also shows that this name still has power.
Definitely.
And this name and the aura, the mystique around the name and the wealth and the power. If you show up at a big party and say, "Oh, I'm a member of the Rothschilds, and here's a picture of my vineyard in Saint-Tropez, and here's a picture of my yacht," people are going to go, "Ooh, can I get some of that?"
Yeah.
People just kind of lose their minds when they're around the kind of stratospheric wealth that the Rothschilds, really still have. Mm-hmm. Even if they don't have what they used to have, they're still incredibly wealthy. They're just very quiet about it. An actual Rothschild probably would not be going to places like that. They live very quiet lives most of the time. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be in the tabloids. That's a failure for them.
It does make me wonder, in many, not all, but many large families that are successful, powerful, influential across many generations, they're just by the law of averages, eventually there's going to be someone who goes rogue. There's going to be someone who is, if not the outcast of the family, but just somebody who sees things differently and is willing to do things that traditionally people in the family haven't. Now, whether that's, RFK Jr. coming out politically different from where many of his family members were, or others. But is there anyone in the world today who's a direct descendant of this branch of the Rothschilds who has actually gone rogue and endorsed any of these theories or done anything like that?
It's interesting because certainly members of the family have gone their own way. You have somebody like David de Rothschild, is a really well-known environmentalist. You had on the other spectrum of that, somebody like Nat Rothschild, who's based in London, who's gotten mixed up with people like Oleg Deripaska and some of the Russian mafia money and some of the influence over the election. So they sort of all go their own ways. And of course, the family itself is enormous. Yeah. And it's not one united monolith. It's a bunch of people who have the ability to kind of do whatever they want. Most of them do it quietly. A few of them do it loudly, but they very rarely discuss any of the myths about them. I reached out to members of the family, and it was basically like, no, we don't talk about this. Yeah. Good luck. Yeah. One of them is a documentary filmmaker who made a film about one of the Rothschild heirs, who was the so-called jazz baroness, the Nika Rothschild, who funded a lot of the jazz in New York in the 50s and 60s. But, so she got interviews with people like Lord Jacob Rothschild, but they're not talking about the myths about them. They're talking about this one specific person. generally they don't talk about any of this stuff. The people who interview them don't ask about any of it. I don't think they want to talk about it. I don't think there's anything for them to say. The one instance that I point out in the book is when David Rothschild, who's a really well-known environmentalist, went on InfoWars. I have no idea why. I have no idea how that happened. But, it's truly a train wreck of listening to Alex Jones yell at this guy, and David de Rothschild is just laughing at him about how weird and stupid he is. It's very strange listening, but other than that, they really have made very little effort to push back against any of this.
It is amazing to me that, with culture and pop culture being so infused with these theories, that it's been so rare that that's happened, that really does stand out as somebody saying, InfoWars is influencing millions of people, and I can't just sit silently. I'm going to go on there and know that it's, in a sense, a losing battle. But for the sake of integrity, pushing back against pop culture is hard because it's so squishy and amorphous. But one person saying, I have to do this, as you describe it, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. Did it actually accomplish anything? It's hard to say, but I can't fault him for trying.
Yeah, he tried at least. And he had a book that he'd written about, environmental causes. And he was able to talk about the book on InfoWars. I don't imagine anyone bought it because of InfoWars, but, it is trying and it is pushing back. It's so hard to do because it's so pervasive and it's so difficult to prove that things are not true.
Well, to close each episode, Mike, we reach into our cheddar box and find a random question. This one for you. In what country other than your own would you most like to live and why?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. Well, I went on our honeymoon in Ireland and I loved it. The people were incredibly friendly. The food was amazing. Just a really, really wonderful vibe there. The Guinness is better there. It's true that a Guinness in an Irish pub is just going to be better than a Guinness in an American bar. I would love to go back there and spend some real time living there. It was just and
you've given some pretty good reasons for it.
Yeah.
Right. You've given, people, the place and the beer. I mean, that's
really all you need.
That's not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Mike, thank you for spending the time. It's been, I won't say it's fun to talk about anti-Semitic conspiracies and their intersection with culture, but it's an important topic and I'm glad people have heard about it. If they want more, you've written a book about QAnon, you've written the book Jewish Space Lasers, about a lot of what we talked about here. And you're working on some other conspiracy related writings, right?
Yeah. So I'm working on another book and trying to kind of tie together all of the conspiracism of the last 30 some odd years, basically the sort of the post-Soviet American descent into paranoia as reflected in politics and also in pop culture. I'm also working on a documentary adaptation of Jewish Space Lasers, working on some other things. And, unfortunately, this stuff is not going to go away anytime soon. Whatever happens in the election, whatever happens in the future, this cat is out of the bag, and we need to really embrace that and kind of figure out what we do about it.
Right on. Mike, thanks again.
Thank you.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.